of First Friday Facebook Live with your favorite New England Aquarium educators, Taylor and Nick. But there's a third person with us today. We're lucky to be joined by a special guest. This is Chris. Chris is the supervisor of our Changing Exhibits Gallery. We are also coming to you from a special room up on the 5th floor of the building, so if you hear a lot of noise, we apologize. We're going to try to speak nice and loud for you. But anyway, back to Chris. Chris is here today because he specializes in the culturing or growing of jellies. And that just happens to be the topic of our Facebook Live, jelly culturing. So this is just all worked out splendidly, I think. While there are so many interesting things that we could discuss about jellies, we decided to focus on culturing because the aquarium has some expertise and history as it relates to this skill. Jelly culturing in general is a more sustainable practice than capturing wild jellies, and it helps us to better understand their growth. On top of all of this, like I said, we're speaking to you from one of our jelly culturing rooms here at the New England Aquarium. So we'll be using the surroundings and Chris's help to take you on a journey all about what it means to grow a jelly. So buckle up. It's going to be a wild ride. Here we go.
Okay, here we go. So as Nick mentioned, jelly culturing is the process by which our aquarists grow jellies in human care. Weirdly enough, most of the jellies here at the aquarium are not on view to the public, and this is because we are currently only displaying adults, the adult form of jellyfish known as Medusa. So this is actually one of the reasons we decided to come behind the scenes here today, because behind the scenes we have every phase of jelly from larvae to adults. So rather than constantly collecting jellies from the wilds, we grow them here at the aquarium. We raise them up to their adult form, which is what you can see in the exhibit in the temperate gallery on the second floor. And we do this for a number of reasons, which we'll touch on a little bit later. Part of the reason is so that we can always have jellyfish on display. To understand what I mean about that, we have to understand a little bit about the process of jelly culturing. And so first we got to talk about the jelly life cycle. So if I asked you to close your eyes and to picture a jellyfish, which we don't actually call them jellyfish here because they're not fish, my guess is you would probably be picturing something like what's floating behind Nick's head. But jellyfish don't necessarily look just like this. They can also look almost like a teeny tiny firework, or they can look kind of like an anemone. So the complete life cycle of a moon jelly. We're going to start it off with the larvae. So they settle on a hard substrate like a rock that will develop into a polyp. So polyps in this form look really similar to their cousins, and that would be coral and anemones. So they have stocky bodies with all these little tentacles that stick up, which are perfect for grabbing microscopic food items. When water conditions are just right, the polyp will do something called strobilation. Science words. Polyps transform in what almost looks like a stack of coffee filters. So they're kind of all on top of each other and they get really elongated. The top layer will flake off and this will become an ephyra. So this is the next phase in the jelly life cycle. I like to think of these guys almost as the teenagers of the jelly world. And interesting, one polyp can make many, many ephyrae, which I think is really interesting. After, they will move out of that phase and into the medusa, or the adult phase. And that's kind of probably what you think of when you think of jellies. The adults will then reproduce, and the whole process starts all over again. And you can find individuals in every phase of the jelly life cycle in this room. Woo. So now that we know a little bit about the life cycle of a jelly and how that works, Chris, what is the goal of culturing jellies here at the New England Aquarium?
Yeah, so in order to keep our exhibits stocked, we ultimately want to have, as Taylor was mentioning, all stages of their life phases available to us. Jellies typically have a fairly short lifespan, so we want to always ensure that we have the younger populations growing up behind the scenes to replace the aging adults. Another cool thing for us is we also want to work with a variety of different types of jellies, styles of jellies, shapes of jellies, just to give our visitors something cool to come see when they come back to visit, something different.
Very cool.
Very cool. Okay, so based on the goals that Chris was just talking about, let's expand a little bit on exactly how we go about culturing jellies here at the aquarium. Chris mentioned having all phases of jellies' life cycles growing in our culture rooms at a given time, and that's definitely not an easy task to do. Luckily, we have a pretty good understanding of some of the things that are necessary for jellies to grow during these different phases. First off, we want to make sure that their habitat is appropriate for their life stage. Life stage.
Stage.
That's a new word. Life stage, yeah. So like Taylor was mentioning earlier, larval jellies actually need a hard substrate to settle upon so that they can continue to develop. We use things like petri dishes or other small containers for this. Larger adult jellies, like the ones in the tanks behind us here, need a little bit more space, typically a slow current of water and no sharp edges in their tanks so that they can avoid injuring themselves. And then at each life stage, food is also an important component of keeping them healthy. Jellies in early life stages are mostly eating planktonic foods such as rotifers or brine shrimp, which are really microscopic animals. Recently, we focused a lot on growing these food sources on site, which Chris also knows a whole lot about, and that makes things more sustainable as a whole, which is obviously our goal. Some jellies in their adult stages will still eat this planktonic food, but others might be fed larger items such as chopped up fish or even smaller jellies. Whoa. I know, jellies eating jellies. It's a little bit shocking, but nature. It's wild out there. Yeah. Anyway, keeping jellies healthy in their different life stages is one thing, but what about encouraging them to grow up through their different life stages? Well, we take a rather ingenious approach to this part of jelly culturing. There are different environmental cues that might affect a jelly's growth rate and reproduction in the wild, of which one of the cues is temperature. While we mostly have cold water jelly species here in our collection, these jellies would still be experiencing seasonal changes in temperature out in the ocean that would signal that time is passing. So that when we want our jellies to continue growing naturally here, well, in simple terms, we change the temperature. Chris and the other jelly aquarists will cycle jellies through our version of seasonal temperature changes, which often requires having to move the jellies from tank to tank in order to allow multiple groups to grow at the same time. Now, what about getting adult jellies to reproduce? Well, most adult jellies will typically reproduce naturally towards the end of their life. However, we still need to take an active role in this part of the process to ensure that eggs and sperm mix and that fertilized larvae make it into those settling containers. Chris, do you want to expand a little bit on how we get our jellies to reproduce here at the aquarium?
Yeah, so as Nick sort of hinted, jellies have a very short lifespan, and in the wild, that sort of coincides with seasonal changes, which also coincides with temperature changes. So if you think spring to summer, summer to fall, in the lab we can actually mimic those conditions. So as a jelly starts to get older, we can actually either increase or decrease the temperature, sort of fool it into thinking it's coming to the end of its lifespan. And believe it or not, there are males and there are female jellies. Males have sperm, females carry eggs. As they get to the end of their life cycle, they release those sperm and eggs. We can collect that material, and then as we were talking about earlier, that becomes the fertilized planula stage or larval stage of the jelly, which will then become the polyp, as Taylor was talking about earlier.
Very cool.
How do you tell a male and a female jelly apart?
Very carefully. It's really hard. Yeah, it's really hard just by looking at a jelly to know if it's a male and a female, but under the microscope, we can actually take small portions of that and determine whether it's carrying eggs or sperm.
Very cool.
Yeah.
All right, so now that we've covered the what and the how of jelly culturing, let's talk a little bit about the why. So why do we culture jellies here at the New England Aquarium? I briefly mentioned this earlier, and both Chris and Nick have kind of touched on it a little bit as well, but jellies don't last very long in their medusa or adult form. Of course, exactly how long will vary based on the species, the size of the jelly, and the water conditions that it's living in. But Even here at the aquarium, in perfect water conditions with no predators and plenty of access to delicious food prepared lovingly by Chris, our jellies will only last for about 3 to 6 months in their adult phase. We have a couple of larger species that maybe we could get to a couple of years, but typically this means if we want to have jellies on exhibit consistently, we need to either be growing jellies or collecting jellies constantly. Here in New England, adult jellies typically thrive during the late spring and early summer. Again, this is when water conditions are kind of just right. But by late summer, those water conditions are no longer right, and adult jellies will start to disappear. We've also haven't been able to find jellies reliably in the Boston Harbor over the last couple of years. So all of this means that growing jellies is by far the more sustainable and reliable choice for displaying jellies here at the aquarium. As Chris mentioned, we are also periodically growing jellies for other institutions that don't have the capacity to grow jellies here at, or don't have the capacity to grow jellies at their facility. So you may have noticed there's a lot of space that is taken up by growing jellyfish. There's also a lot of time and care involved to get jellies perfect and ready for exhibits. So for just the few tanks that we have here at the aquarium, it's a lot of work, and some aquariums might not have the resources to do this successfully, but would really like to share these incredible animals with their visitors. Zoos and aquariums are really collaborative, much more than you might initially think, and we are happy to send animals, including jellies, to other institutions. And sometimes this might be surplus jellies, so jellies that we have extra of, or unexpected jellies. And in other cases, it might be a special request for a specific species that we raise here at the aquarium. So the aquarium hasn't always grown jellyfish. In fact, this room was once used for research on mussels, I've been told. Not that kind of mussel, think shellfish. On that note, Nick, can you and Chris tell us a little bit about the history of jelly culturing here at the aquarium?
We would be happy to.
All right.
Yeah, sure. So back in 2004, the aquarium opened the Amazing Jellies exhibit. It was a 12-tank jellyfish exhibit that emphasized that jellies are survivors and are actually likely to increase with climate change, which is something that is a little bit contentious right now in terms of scientists
we'll
being
get into that.
confident about that for sure, but we'll talk a little bit about that later, yeah. But anyway, this exhibit featured quite a few different species that we were culturing on site. And since then, jellies have moved around the aquarium, around the building. They found homes in some different exhibits. In addition, we used to mass produce jellies for commercial purposes as well. In fact, we were the second largest producer of jellies in the U.S. So our culturing practices used to be quite expansive, but we've scaled down our efforts in more recent times. Chris, you want to talk to us a little bit about what jelly culturing looks like today, and maybe how many jellies we grow and where do they go once we have them?
Yeah, so as Nick said, as far as keeping animals in captivity, especially in aquariums, jellies are a relatively new thing. It sort of started back in the 60s. The New England Aquarium has had a jelly program for about 20 plus years. Initially it was, as Nick mentioned, it was here to support a special exhibit on jellies. But again, even after that exhibit left, we kept space behind the scenes dedicated to rearing new jellies. All told, I would say we can still produce thousands, if not tens of thousands of jellies each year. If they don't go into our own exhibits, there are plenty in zoos and aquariums who are happy to take them for their own exhibits.
Wow.
Very cool.
Thousands of jellies.
Thousands.
That's pretty incredible. It sounds like a lot of work. Fortunately, Chris is our jelly expert today, but he isn't the only person to care for jellyfish here at the aquarium. After all, we can't keep Chris here 7 days a week, as much as we would probably like to. But there's a whole team of staff that help keep these beautiful gelatinous sea creatures in our exhibit. So, Chris, can you walk us through the day in the life of a jellies aquarist? Maybe share a little bit about the day-to-day care for our jellies?
Yeah, so the first thing we do is kind of come in and just make an observation of how the jellies look in their tanks. We want to make sure they're moving appropriately. Nick kind of hinted at this before, but jellies require a very specialized holding tank, a little not quite the same as normal fish keeping. These tanks keep them suspended, and it also keeps them from bumping into the edges. Jellies are very delicate by nature, so we want to keep them sort of moving around so that they can collect their food. Another part of caring for our jellies is making sure they have enough food throughout the day. Jellies are constantly eating. That's how they survive in the wild, is that they're just floating around and collecting food. So we need to spend a lot of time growing our own food, which is a lot of live brine shrimp. And then we mix in a lot of other planktonic food that the jellies need to grow and thrive. As the jellies get bigger, I sort of equate it a lot to like growing plants. As they get bigger, you need to find a bigger pot. So there's a lot of time spent moving jellies as they get large into larger tanks, different styles of tanks.
Cool. To be clear, jellyfish are not plants.
Jellyfish are not
Not
plants.
plants.
And this
They're
is
animals.
coming from someone who knows a lot about plants. But that's for a different Facebook
That is
Live.
a different Facebook
Yeah.
Live.
Wow. So yeah, we've learned quite a bit about jelly culturing today, thanks to Chris. This has been great.
Yeah, thank you.
The aquarium is lucky to have you around.
Thanks.
You hear that? The aquarium is lucky to have Chris around. I think one way to tie this all together is to touch upon the significance of jellies, not just here, but on our planet. After all, scientists believe that jellies are the earliest known animal to have organized tissues in their body. Jelly fossils found in China have even been estimated from over 600 million years ago, which is significantly older than horseshoe crabs and dinosaurs. Their diversity is also extensive, with estimates pointing to the possibility that over 2,000 species currently live in our oceans. The real number might even be higher than that. One of the reasons jellies have been so successful has to do with their adaptability to different ocean conditions. While many animals struggle when temperatures get too high or waters become polluted, jellies can actually thrive under these conditions. Now, in recent times, many observers have stated that jelly populations are growing larger and larger, and that they're showing up in areas that they didn't previously exist in. And there have even been some claims that this is all tied to climate change and warming oceans. However, it's important to note that we still have a lot to learn about wild populations of jellies, including what their normal population sizes are and where they're naturally found. What a normal thing is like for a jelly, and what their
just don't
normal
know.
patterns are.
Yeah.
We don't
Yeah.
really know. Yeah. What we can say for certain is that jellies can serve as an indicator species and can actually tell us about what might be happening to our oceans in terms of overall health. And as monitoring ocean health becomes more and more important, monitoring populations of animals like jellies will also be important as a tool for this process as well. And as we like to say here a lot at the aquarium, healthy oceans are the driving force behind a healthy planet and healthy humans. Chris, do you have anything that you want to add to that at all?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just want to thank you guys for having me here.
Awesome.
It's good to have you, man.
Thank you for being here, and don't worry, you're not done yet,
Okay.
because this is the part where we ask our amazing audience out there on the internet if they have any questions about jellyfish or anything that we've talked about today. So that being said, we got any questions from the audience this morning?
We do indeed. Do you ever get
Amazing.
stung by jellyfish?
Oh, this is a Chris question.
Yeah.
I promised we would have more questions for you.
It happens. Yeah, it's sort of a
Hazard
I
of
do
the
my
job.
best. A hazard of the job. Yeah. You have to have your hands in the tanks. That's part of cleaning, and every once in a while there's a little bit of contact. I'm fortunate enough that I've never been stung really bad, but it does happen. Yeah.
Worst sting ever,
Worst thing I ever got was by a flower hat jelly,
which you can see in the temper gallery
which
right
are
now.
currently in the temperate gallery, and it got me right on the inner arm as I was talking to somebody cleaning, and it really burned. Really burned.
Ouch.
And we get this question a lot too, Taylor. All true jellies can sting, right, guys?
Correct.
That's a good way to define what a jelly is.
Yeah, a lot of them don't have enough potency to get through human skin, but yes, jellies can sting, even if it's just something really small.
Good
Okay.
to know. Any
All right.
Can
other-
jellyfish see?
Can jellyfish see?
Whoa.
Jellyfish eyeballs. This is actually one of my favorite questions you get about jellyfish, because the answer is maybe. Yeah. There are definitely some species of jellies that have eye spots. So we've talked about eye spots before, in that they're not quite the same as my eyes or Chris or Nick's eyes, but they can generally sense light, movement, shape, And exactly how complex those eye spots are on different species of jellies, we're still trying to figure out. But I have read some sources that say there are some species of jellies that do have a somewhat complex and maybe even more complex than we initially thought eye spot. Do you have anything to add about that, Chris?
Yeah, there's actually some studies that show that some box jellies can actually avoid obstacles. So they have these little spots on them that will actually see probably more shapes, shadows, but they can actually avoid things as they're swimming, which is wild.
Pretty
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
None of these animals have brains, so you gotta,
No
gotta give them a
brain.
little bit of credit for that.
But
For sure.
eyeballs. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a
Weird.
good one.
Okay, speaking of weird jellyfish facts, like do they have eyes? What is your favorite weird jellyfish fact?
So one thing I learned when I was working with jellies in here, jellies cannot cohabitate. Different species don't get along, and it sort of dawned on me that, again, these animals don't have a brain. If you put its brothers and sisters in the tame tank, they get along just great, but if you put two non-related species together, they sting the hell out of one another. And it's a really strange thing, and I don't really have an answer as to how they can recognize a different species. It's all just reflex and nerve action. It's really odd.
Again,
Yeah.
no brains.
Yeah. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
That's
I
crazy.
think that's super cool. Do you have a favorite jellyfish fact, Nick?
Man, I like Chris's fact a lot. I guess another interesting part of their life cycle that you guys were both talking about a little bit is the fact that they can sort of go back and forth, almost like a seesaw. And so it's caused some people to label some types of jellies as immortal,
Ooh,
just
good
because they can sort of go back and forth. Like I was saying, in their life cycle, they can sort of, depending on conditions, they can go backwards. And anyway, I'm saying the same thing over and over again. But that's a pretty amazing adaptation that jellies have. And
Yeah.
again, we keep mentioning this at the end, but no brain, right? So still having
Very
these,
few
having
organs,
these-
no heart, no lungs,
Right,
blood.
no
Yeah.
blood. Yeah.
But I think this is one of the adaptations that's made them so hardy and made them so successful for so many years,
Yep.
as we were talking
Yeah.
about too. Yeah.
And if you're interested in learning more about that, I encourage you to look up immortal jellies because that
Yes.
is one species that we know for sure does this thing that Nick was mentioning where they can actually go back, revert to their polyp form. But there are suspicions that other species also can do this. So there's still some research to be done out there with that. Super cool jelly fact, Nick.
Yeah.
Nice job. We have any other questions out there this morning?
Mark from Facebook wants to know if the aquarium has tried growing siphonophores.
Okay. First, Chris, you want to break down what a siphonophore is?
So the term jelly is a little bit of a loose term. We sort of use that to incorporate anything gelatinous that looks a little
Soft,
bit like a
squishy.
jelly.
Yeah.
Siphonophores are a completely different class of jellies. It's nothing we have here. They're actually a colony of animals as opposed to like one medusa. Some typical siphonophores that people might be familiar with are like the Portuguese man-o-war. The answer is no. We've never tried. We one time had a Portuguese man-o-war in captivity. If you've seen one in the wild, they have like a float mechanism, and then all their tentacles are sort of drifting below them.
Cool.
That doesn't fit our style of tank here, which keeps that sort of suspension going.
That
so
makes sense.
no one's
Yeah.
really cracked the nut on how to keep a siphonophore in captivity.
Too floaty.
Too floaty.
Interesting. That's the technical term for it.
Yeah.
That's right.
Science.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah.
To build on that, what are some other jelly-like creatures that live in the ocean?
Cool.
Yeah, that's a good one.
So siphonophores, definitely. Also, ctenophores
Yeah.
are another one. And occasionally we do have those on exhibit on the second floor. The most frequent species are probably lady-comb jellies,
Yeah.
which are not true jellies because they don't sting.
Correct.
But they're incredibly spectacular to watch because they have all these little hairs all over their body called cilia, and they're really good at refracting light. So it looks like they're making rainbows all over their body. A lot of people, when they initially see them, think they're bioluminescing because the light display is so spectacular. But it's just that Chris and the Jellies team have gotten really good at angling the lights just right to make them look as cool as possible.
Yeah, they're like living prisms.
yeah.
They're really cool.
Yeah, really cool. Any other ones you can think of?
Oh man, I mean, there's
Salps?
Even like, I mean, like Chris was saying, the jellies grouping includes a lot of different types of things that don't have that sort of traditional look when we think of a jelly, like we were talking about. But
and Nick mentioned there's 2,000 jellies that have been described, but there's probably oodles and oodles that people have never seen before.
Also the scientific term, oodles.
Right. Yeah.
It's a technical term.
It's a really specific number.
That's right. Yeah.
Awesome.
Who knows what's out there?
Yeah.
That is one of my favorite things about the ocean. I think there's just so much we don't know about our oceans, and there's so much more to discover, especially with some of these species like jellies, which maybe people aren't like top priority for research and studying. So lots to learn out there.
Indeed.
Yeah. Any last questions this morning? Well, those were amazing questions. Thank you so much. We got a lot of good ones this morning. And as I always tell you, remember, just because you're not watching this live doesn't mean you can't ask a question. Our social media team is incredible at monitoring your comments. So if you do have a question after this, just post it in the comments. We'll get back to you. We'll post the answers in there. And if we don't know the answer, we'll ask Chris, because again, jelly expert. And I just, again, want to say thank you to Chris for coming today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Especially in that Q&A session. I was like, oh, good thing Chris is standing here next to me helping answer questions about jellyfish. It was really fun having you. And if you have more questions about jellyfish, feel free to come in, talk to an educator. Again, they're on the second floor in our temperate gallery, and we're constantly rotating species. Thanks to Chris and his team, we have lots of new jellyfish to put in those tanks for you. So even if you were here last month, come back next month. There might be a totally different type of jelly for you to check out. And before we leave today, we have to do our shout-outs. And this shout out today is for Emily G. Emily is that voice that you hear asking all of the questions off camera in our Facebook Live. And Emily is leaving us, and we're super sad because she is Facebook Live our OG. So I just want to say thanks to Emily.
Thanks, Emily.
And we're going to miss her. And if you're going to miss Emily shouting out questions from the sidelines, make sure you wish Emily good luck as well. All right, friends. I think that brings us to the end. What do you think, Nick?
I think so.
Caused enough mayhem this morning? Perfect.
I think so.
Happy Friday, my friends. I hope you have an awesome weekend. Make sure to tune in again next month for our next First Friday Facebook Live.
That's right.
We'll see you next time, guys.
Last one of the year, actually, yeah.
Amazing.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
See you guys.